Meaning after trauma and crisis. How can we still live a meaningful life despite trauma or crisis? So the question is, how can we still live a meaningful life despite trauma and crisis that may have happened later in our life? I'll start talking about this, and later I'll talk about how can we live a meaningful life despite of early life trauma, such as having had very bad parents, for instance. But first, how do we deal with trauma and crisis? So it may be helpful to first have a think about what is actually meaning in life, because I'm using the term, and some people who have followed some of my other lectures, you already know this, but it's kind of a refresher of that. So research is showing that when we use an expression such as meaning in life, usually I use that to describe like a total experience, because it's like living a meaningful life. It's more like an adjective, you know, like it's how we live our lives. And it's like a total experience. It's almost like as if you're sailing through life. I don't know whether you've ever been sailing, but when you sail, it's like a total experience. A lot of things happen at the same time. Same is about living a meaningful life. It's not only one thing. It's so many things at the same time that are happening that define something as what's meaningful for you. So this is like a summary of what research is showing, what meaning in life is about. In the first place, when we use words like meaning, then it's about certain directions that we go. We move towards a direction, a purpose, a goal. And that's, for example, when you sail, you often move in towards a direction, for instance, of a lighthouse at the horizon. But also, when we sail, we often have certain values. For instance, I love to do a lot of sailing in my teenage years. And I often had the value like to really use the sail, even though our boat had a motor. But like, hey, come on, I'm a real sailor, so I'm not going to use the motor. So I was following values. The same in life is when we move in towards our directions in life, we can do that by following our own values and our own ethics, for instance. But also, it's also about an understanding of where are we, for instance, being aware of the people around us, our place in the world, also our place in life, for instance, knowing how many more years do we have to live, things like that. It's almost as if we know the place on the map where we are with our sailing boat in the total experience of sailing through life. It's also about navigating, because it's very nice if you know all the things, if you have a goal, if you know where you are, if you know your values, but you still need to do it. So we need to have those specific skills, how to translate it into daily life action. So we need to know how do we actually do it? How do we navigate? How do we actually raise a sail? Things like that. These are very practical skills about, for instance, know how to set goals, control your response to the situation, things like that. But also it's important that we feel worthy enough to go sailing and to follow our own motivation instead of like doing what others expect us to do. Well, sometimes we can still do that, but I mean like not automatically copy pasting what others tell us what is meaningful in our lives. It's also about being able to get through storms in life, and this is very much what we're talking about today, because how can we still live a meaningful life despite the emotional turmoil that all of us will inevitably experience in life? And finally, meaning in life is also about doing it, because very often we just sit on the shore and we don't go out sailing. So living a meaningful life is a combination of all those things. And what happens when there's a trauma or when there is a crisis in our life? An example is, for instance, when we are homebound due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Or what do we do when we are confronted with a chronic or a life-threatening disease? What do we do with that? How can we still live a meaningful life? And what happens with all of that? So in the first place, often those goals that we have at the horizon, that lighthouse where we were going to, that may be stopped. For instance, because due to the pandemic, we couldn't go outside anymore. So things like going to the pub, going to a concert, that wasn't able anymore. We couldn't do that. So those meanings were temporarily blocked. However, we can always still follow our values. Even though our goals may change, we can always use our values. We can always continue following our ethics. But it can be very challenging when we are in big storms in life to continue following our ethics, because we can be really challenged, because we live in a very narcissistic and a very selfish society where people are stimulated to be selfish. But we can decide to continue following our values. It's also sometimes that we may feel lost in life, that we feel as if we don't know where we are in life anymore, as if we have lost the map of life. And then it's very much important to learn more or less to understand where are we in life, what is our location, where and how much more time do I have to live, for example. Sometimes we also struggle with living a meaningful life because we don't know how to do it. And it can be helpful to ask others for help, to ask them, hey, can you help me? You've done something similar before in your life. How did you deal with this? How did you deal with your traumas? How have you done that? And very important is a lot of people who have gone through trauma, they struggle often with a lot of self-worth. And it's very important to rebuild a sense of self-worth because you're worthy, to listen to your own meaning in life and not to throw away your life by following and doing just what others are saying. And so also what I often see is that when a trauma happens is the body often responds with this fight, flight or freeze mechanism. You may have heard of that in one of our previous sessions at IMEC. And so our body sometimes says, well, we need to conserve, we need to stand still to protect ourselves. But due to that, we're not coming into action anymore and we forget that. And we're stuck, almost as if we're sitting at the shore and we're not taking our sailing boat and go out on the water. It's like sometimes we just need to force ourselves to do something, go on holiday or do go to job, even though it may be challenging. But often when you start getting out again, then it may start flowing again. So this is a first thing that I can say about how to live a meaningful life despite of any crisis or trauma. The next slide, oh, it's just copying here the same, but the next slide, this is also a thing that you may have heard from me a lot in some of my other lectures. You can also read more of this in some other of my text, but also videos. So I will only go through this very quickly. It's research that I've conducted shows that worldwide, in over 45,000 people find in all different countries that it can find meaning in 6 different types of meanings. So people can find meaning in materialistic things, such as material possessions, security, success in your job. People can't find meaning in hedonistic stuff, so that's about just enjoying things, in having nice experiences, going to the cinema, having sex, things like that. It can also be about self-oriented types of meaning, so about your self-development, autonomy, self-expression. Then people can find meaning in social types of meaning, so that's about connections, belonging to a community, helping others. But some people also have a sense of larger types of meanings in life, such as higher purposes, personal growth, or a sense of justice and ethics, trying to make the world a better place, religion, stuff like that. And finally, some people, they come with some more philosophical types of meanings, such as the people say, well, I'm just grateful for the fact that I'm there. I'm grateful for life as a gift. So what we see is that usually people have multiple examples from either of those categories or those different types of meaning in their life. What we know is that when people focus dominantly on materialistic, hedonistic or self-oriented types of meanings, usually those people suffer from mental health or physical health problems. Whereas when you focus more on social and larger types of meanings, usually those people have a better well-being. And so what happens during, like, when you're traumatized? What happens when there's a crisis? So there are many things that can happen with those different types of meaning, and we'll go into some examples of that in some of the next slides. But I can already say what you often see is that people start to shift. People often shift their priorities. A good example is that during the pandemic, people suddenly started to realize that, well, what's more important in life are the social values and the larger meanings. Like that they were saying, well, in the past I've been focusing so much on my work. But hey, how important is that? My family life, my home life is way more important. We've seen that in a lot of research as well. But on the other hand, some other people, they actually cling on more onto materialistic types of meanings, or they become obsessed and addicted to things like Netflix. And what we see is when people in that crisis, when they start to stick so much to those materialistic, hedonistic or self-oriented types of meanings, when that is what they are focusing on, then usually you see that they're struggling with the mental health because they're not focusing on the social or larger types of meanings anymore. And also during the pandemic, what you see is it was very difficult to have the social connections, to really also live like a life according to our justice and ethics, because it was so difficult to do anything outside of our house. So a lot of people were struggling with that, and that had a huge impact on the mental health. So in general, some tips and tricks is it's recommended to have examples of all those different types of meanings, but particularly have between 3 and 6 important meanings in life. Because if one falls away, for instance due to the pandemic or due to a trauma, then you still have other types of meanings. Also create a kind of a hierarchy of meanings in your own experience. And I often say, well, just pick a bunch of post-its and write one type of meaning or one example of meaning on each post-it. And put them like in a category, almost like a mountain, you know, or like a ladder from the lowest meanings, the least important, to the most important meanings. It can be very helpful for yourself to understand, like, what is it really that matters in life? Because when you're struggling with some of the less important meanings in life, then you can still say, well, listen, hey, how important is this? Have a look at those bigger ones. They're more important. And that will help you to have a sense of resilience when there is a crisis. It's also important, as I said, for mental physical health to focus on the social larger types of meaning. And to mainly have like a dominant focus on that. Whereas like all types of meaning can be helpful, but the main focus should, I dare to say, be the social large types of meanings. And also if you start to feel, well, I'm not sure about life, I'm not totally happy about it, that kind of fake discomfort, I'm always saying take that serious. And it's often when people struggle with a sense of meaning in life, it's often not with a full-blown existential crisis. No, it's often more that sense of, yeah, this is not it. I'm just struggling. I'm just take it serious and ask yourself, okay, what's going on? Am I really doing the things that are really meaningful for me? And quite often what happens with a trauma is that the trauma can make us aware of that. The trauma can make us aware that we suddenly start to realize, well, what's really important? If my life is so brief, if anything horrible can happen, if anything traumatic or a crisis can happen any moment, so life is very short apparently. What do I want to focus on in my limited time in life then? So I've created this very full slide. I'm not going to go through all those examples, but this is like a very complete overview of what does this practically mean when we're confronted with a trauma. So for yourself, have a think about a recent traumatic experience or a crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Have a think for yourself, which examples do you recognize? So in the first place, a lot of people, when they're confronted with a trauma or a crisis, they can still continue living a meaningful life. The same things remain meaningful, and very often a lot of people are able to say, well, yes, there's a crisis, there's a trauma, I'm having challenges, but at the same time, while I'm recognizing that, at the same time, I still see that I can still live a meaningful life. So that's being able to hold those paradoxes, hold those dualities, to say, yes, it's challenging, but I still know what's meaningful, and I'm still doing my best to do what's meaningful in my life. And actually, like, focusing on what's meaningful can actually help people through a crisis. I'll say more about that on the next slides. Some people then may start to experience some minor changes in their meanings in life. For instance, because a previous meaning becomes unattainable. Such as during the pandemic, we couldn't go outside anymore. We couldn't go and see a football match or see a band. But also sometimes certain meanings start to become less valuable, or new meanings may arise. For instance, during the pandemic, a lot of people started to value their home life suddenly, which they had not realized before. So priorities in life may change temporarily. But also what may happen is, for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, is that people developed a very narrow focus on their daily life, and they forgot what is really important in life. So people became addicted to things like Netflix, as an example. But people may also experience some large positive changes in how to live a meaningful life. For instance, because they start to see what really matters. This is also called post-traumatic growth by psychologists. So that after trauma, people can grow. And also how people can develop a better balance in their lives. And for instance, they start to see, well, I shouldn't waste my life anymore on those materialistic, hedonistic, or the selfish types of meanings in life. Let's focus more on the people in my life, or there's larger purpose in my life, on my ethics, on my religion. Also, people may start to use their intuition more as a source to discover their meaning in life, instead of being too heady, for instance. They start to get connected more with their intuitions. And it's often very important also for people who come out of a narcissistic relationship, for example, is to relearn or possibly learn for the first time to really listen to what your intuition is really telling you what's meaningful for you. Because often when we are like victim of narcissistic abuse, and that can be very difficult to learn to listen to ourselves. But we can learn to do that after we come out of the trauma, for instance, of narcissistic abuse. It can also be that we start to experience life more intensely because we start to realize how limited life is or how short life is. However, some individuals report some large negative changes in their lives. It's, for instance, also some, that people start to become afraid, for example. Or that people become dominantly focused on what they cannot do or what they must or must not do. So, for example, that people can become totally obsessed with their body when they're sick. I've worked a lot with cancer patients. And I've seen some patients who become so obsessed with the cancer that they always talk as a patient all the time when you talk with them. And they've almost forgot that they were also a daughter, they were a friend, they were a music lover, etc. Sometimes I also see that people start to shift suddenly more towards materialistic, hedonistic, or self-oriented types of meanings, particularly when the trust in other people have been really undermined. When you've had a traumatic experience where you found out that other people betray you, you can feel very helpless and you can give up hope on mankind. And then you think, well, sod it, I'm just gonna look after myself. That's the only thing that matters. And then also, people can also start to become more think from the head in the way how instead of like connecting with their feelings, they almost disconnect from the feelings. It's also a response people can have towards in response to any traumas. Finally, people can experience some sense of existential terror, and that means that people can feel really overwhelmed by the trauma and by the stress, and so that everything meaningful in life starts to feel unimportant, unattainable, and it feels almost as if people are staring into the void, as they call that. And actually, what a lot of people do is either they feel overwhelmed by that void, or they feel stuck and they can't. Nothing feels meaningful anymore. Or the alternative is that they run away from the feeling as far as they can and they try to push it away. Usually people do that via becoming more conservative, via becoming more conformist, nationalistic and racist. There's a lot of research showing that in times of crisis such as the pandemic or such as the cost of living crisis, people become more, people start voting more for the Conservative Party, for the Republican Party. People start to become more racist, things like that. There's a lot of research on that. So think for yourself, which changes have you seen in your life in response to any traumas or any crisis like the pandemic? Have you been able to continue living a meaningful life? Have there been any minor changes, any large changes? Have you experienced existential terror? How does it work for you? So there are a lot of research, and these are some of the main models in the field. You know, I'm just going to skip this slide. It's just saying that how we cope with crisis, how we cope with trauma, it inherently is about how do we make sense of the world? How can we still find meaning in our life? It's very much about that. That's the essence of coping with trauma, I dare to say. And this is also what we can learn from Viktor Frankl. Most likely you will know the book Man's Search for Meaning. And what he said is, for instance, like everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, and that's to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So what he said is like, well, as an example is, he was in a concentration camp, he was an inmate. And what he did was that instead of giving up hope, he continued. And what he did is that he actually he started to help his fellow inmates. An example that I've given recently also at a lecture somewhere, at another lecture from IMEC, one of the things that he also said in what he wrote in the book, it's a beautiful example, is that one day someone ran into the barracks, one of the other fellow inmates, and said, "Hey, come outside, come outside." And then everyone went outside, and the person said, "Look, there's a beautiful sunset there behind the mountains." And that was in the concentration camp. But it was thanks to moments like these, those tiny moments that they focus on what's meaningful, that those connections with other, connections with nature, not wanting to give up, the perseverance is thanks to that attitude that we're able to survive. And there's a lot of research that has confirmed this finding. So be able to live a meaningful life is so helpful. But at the same time, it's important to be realistic. And this is what the priest Niebuhr wrote. And you will know the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Because yes, we can say yes, it's important that there's a lot that we have in our hand, a lot that we have in our own control. Absolutely. Yes, we can find meaning, like Viktor Frankl showed, even in the worst situations that we think about. But at the same time, we should not be unrealistic. We should be realistic, like Viktor Frankl was, about the borders of the concentration camps, about the guards. They were there. He could not escape, literally. So it's about that, having like a realistic optimism, as he called that. Or tragic optimism, he called that. Sorry, that's the word he used. Tragic optimism. So, for example, in my research on COVID-19, for instance, what I wrote about in my book on the psychology of COVID-19, I wrote how a lot has changed in how people find meaning in their lives. Where, in the first place, very often when we talked about each other, also like all the press briefings from 10 Downing Street, that very often humans were reduced to potential viral bombs. That was the only thing on the news. And yes, of course, that was important. We needed to hear what was going on medically, obviously. But due to that, the only thing people were talking about was the materialistic biological aspect of being human, and which kind of distracted from the fact that we are way more than that. And a lot of people started to flee into hedonism, such as fleeing into entertainment, such as the Netflix addiction. Other people started to focus mainly on their own personal survival, their own safety, their own convenience. But also, like for instance, some other people, they were sticking up like the middle finger towards any governmental rules. But at the same time, also in the positive sense, some people chose during the pandemic. They said, well, I'm going to use this time to develop myself. Or just by getting through it, they had a sense of perseverance, and they could be proud of themselves. Also, there was a lot of social meanings going on about using personal protective equipment, for instance, to prevent infecting others. Social support of others. And a lot of people, like I've said, a lot of research shows that a lot of people started to see what really matters in life, such as valuing family home life more. And also people became aware. Suddenly also in newspapers you started to read about topics like freedom, responsibility, things like that. So this is just an example of what a crisis or a trauma can do with people. But now the big question is, and this will be the last part of my presentation, which will take 5 more minutes, and then I will shut my mouth. This is about, okay, we've been talking about how can we live a meaningful life when we're confronted with a trauma or a crisis later in our lives. But how do we actually build a meaningful life when we grow up in a traumatic family, when we grew up in a family where there was crisis after crisis? For instance, when there were like abusive parents, of like physical abuse, sexual abuse, or any emotional abuse, for instance, when you have narcissistic parents, for instance, or when you grow up as a child in a war situation, such as in Ukraine. What do you do? How can you still live a meaningful life? So, as you may have heard from me before in some other of my lectures, I often say, well, our teachers teach us how to write and to do maths. Our parents teach us how to behave. Our governments teach us how to follow the law. But nobody teaches us how to live a meaningful life. This is the thing that I often see, is like that even the best parents struggle with teaching their children how to live a meaningful life. And very often we need to sort this out for ourselves. It can be very hard. But particularly when our parents have not given us like kind of a secure basis, and it's even more difficult to find our own answers. Because learning to ask our own questions, learning to find our own answers, we can only do that when we have learned to trust in ourselves to find those answers. But for instance, when you have had very dominant parents, they were telling you implicitly or explicitly that you had to copy paste what was meaningful for them. For instance, when you grow up in a religious cult, then in the religious cult, then you are expected to follow what the leaders were saying. And that is your reality. You don't think in a different way. You think that is what life is about. That's what you've taught. And so you even don't consider asking questions. And you don't consider asking questions for yourself and to think for yourself. What our parents give us, what teachers give us, or the religious or the political groups in which we grow up, they're very, very determining how we find and determine our own meaning in life later. I will focus on some examples. A very good one is when we talk about attachment. You may have heard about the term. It's like as children, we learn how to do relationships in general, and attachment is a key concept, a key idea. And a great book is called Understanding Disorganized Attachment. I cannot recommend this enough. And so there are different types of attachment styles. So, for example, in your childhood, a child can have enough comfort and confidence. And the caregivers are there when they need them. So the caregivers are sensitive and responsive when they need them. So what then happens, and you can see that in the box below, is if you've had that as children, where your parents are safe enough, what happens there is that the child feels safe enough to actually also start exploring the surroundings. And that's the example that you often see with children. For example, when they come into like a party with a lot of other children, a child will first still stay with the parent. That's normal. But after a while, the child starts to experiment, start to meet others, start to walk around. But when there's anything stressful, the child will run back to the parent as a source of safety. This is an example of a safe attachment, of a secure attachment. And that's also the same as adults, is that we feel, in that case, we feel relaxed and comfortable in the company of others. We try to take experiments and risks in our lives, but in a realistic sense. And if there's stress, we know where we can go back to, and we can go back to others, or we actually can go back to ourselves, to our internal parents, the kind of an internalized personal parent that we have in ourselves, and we start to become our own parents. That's what happens when there's a secure attachment. However, unfortunately, not all children have that. The numbers they vary, but they say that approximately between 60 and 80% of all children grow up with a secure attachment. But that means that at least between 20 and 40% of children growing up in an insecure way. And for instance, that can mean that a child can become very avoidant because they're very afraid of others. That's what they've learned from the parents. Or they can grow up in a very ambivalent way, that they have like a kind of a love-hate relationship all the time with others. Or it can be totally disorganized. And this is what you'll see later in your life, how you relate with others. But you'll also see that in the ways how people find meaning in their life. A good example of that is as well in the so-called schemas. I'm just showing the slide, I'm not going through it, way too many details. But you may have heard about schema therapy, which is a type of cognitive behavior therapy. And what they're saying is that early in our life, what we do is we build some schemas. And a schema is like a core, regular pattern of behavior, emotion, and thoughts, which you often develop early in life. Because we create certain templates, certain expectations about life, and on the basis of the early information we get in our lives from our parents, from attachment, from our parents. But due to that, we develop certain expectations about life, and later in life we still use those same schemas, we use those same templates. Even though they may not be relevant anymore, we're still using that, because that is what we grew up with. And the thing is the thing about schemas, and also the thing about attachment, is that we think that that is the reality. We even don't consider thinking or reflecting about the possibility that there may be another reality. No, because it is the truth. We've always thought and we've always believed this is the truth. So then also the question is, how do we then make decisions? And for instance, like when you were a child, what did you do what did you want to become as an adult? Why did you give up the dream? Or why did you continue that dream? And if you would have a magic wand and you could do anything you like, what would that be? So in other words, how did you develop from the child, from the schemas you had, the attachment you had, into the person you've become now? That's often a combination of all our decisions are like a combination of the things we must do or must not do, cannot do, and things we want and do not want. So for example, like so biology, our personality, but also the attachment style, the things that the lessons our parents have taught us, that determines very much what we can and cannot do in our lives. There's also things that we must and must not do, such as the expectations from our context, but also having to pay taxes. And then there's also things about things we want in our lives or do not want. But very often what we see is in the childhood, we develop a pattern where we start to make decisions only on the basis of one of those. For instance, like in when you grow up in a very authoritarian or in a religious kind of context, very often you learn to make decisions mainly on the basis of what you must. If you grow up in a family where you get all the time the message that you are a weak person, that you cannot do anything. Also, what I see in a lot of people who actually grew up in a kind of an underclass or in some lower socioeconomic classes, that often they still make decisions for themselves in daily life on the basis of what they can or particularly what they cannot do. And so what we often have is that we have like a certain dominant focus in this triangle when we make decisions. So for example, like for each decision, such as shall I go to this lecture, as you can see in this table, like what is it what I can do in that? Well, yeah, it's affordable, but hey, some time investment. Nobody tells me I must go. Yeah, I want to learn more, but yeah, I'm also busy, so yeah. So all those things, all those arguments we have in our head, and then how do we make the decision? In the end, I decided to become because I want to. So the wanting was the dominant one. When you start to analyze several of your decisions or some of your decision dilemmas, you most likely see a pattern. You'll see a pattern that you make decisions, for instance, mainly on the basis of what you want, mainly on the basis of what you must or cannot do. So what it then can be helpful is to start reminding yourself of, hey, how do I usually make decisions? For instance, usually I make decisions on the basis of what I want. I never think about what I must or can do or cannot do. So okay, remind yourself of that. In future, when you start to make decisions, remind yourself there are 3 angles in the decision triangle. And then start to think, okay, what could be an alternative decision? What should I do then? So these are my last slides. Just to say, in sum, like, to live a meaningful life, we can do that despite of trauma and crisis. And it's very important that we take care of our meaning in life, like we take care of our body. Because meaning can really help us to get through a difficult time of trauma and crisis. I'll give some very good examples, some homework exercises almost, if you like to do. This one is extremely powerful. I would recommend that at the end of each day, write down the 3 most important meaningful moments. It can be anything small or anything big, like listening to a bird in a park, enjoying that, feeling connected with nature. Write it down each day. And after 2 weeks, you start to see any patterns. And, or as you could have seen that before, one of those 6 types of meanings in life. And then ask yourself, what can you do to have more of those important meanings in your life and make the change? So it's relatively simple. Just start noticing. And often when you start really writing this down, you start to see it more in your life. Even all those tiny things that you usually forget that you don't see. Also, when you are in a situation of stress, remind yourself of the 6 types of meanings. Surround yourself with meaningful objects. Distract yourself with joyful activities such as nature, body. Take pride in your perseverance and your courage. And connect with meaningful people and help people. And focus on any large and meaningful activities in your life. And just be grateful that you got through this day. And that last one is also very important. Sometimes in stressful periods, the most meaningful thing we can do is just getting through it. And then start planning for yourself in your diary, in your calendar. Plan at least one huge meeting per year, one large meeting per month, one medium meeting per week, and one small meeting per day. If you want to learn more, so on the left you can see my book about 50 pictures of living a meaningful life. It's a kind of a self-help book. The other one is Reinventing Your Life. That's a book from schema therapy, which may help you to see some of those early life schemas that you may have developed in your early life. I really love this book. I rarely recommend self-help books because usually they are totally nonsense. But this one is really good and very evidence-based. Of course, each Monday evening we give now the course Discover Your Meaning in Life, learn how to make decisions, enjoy and live life to the fullest. So this is from 6 until 8 p.m. And then there is the one from 8 until 10 p.m. That's the evidence-based meaning center practitioner certificate. And that's about how to learn how to effectively help your clients live a meaningful life.